Okay, hello everyone. This is a continuation of section 2.2 of Unit A, Biodiversity. We're going to be discussing sexual reproduction. I promised that I'd make my video shorter, but I think this section in particular is going to be a little bit longer because it's pretty detailed. Uh, so reproduction produces new individuals of the species. So reproduction, whether it's done asexually, which we talked about last time, or sexually, it is required to ensure the survival of species over time. Individual organisms are born, they go through the life cycle, and they die. However, the species to which the organisms belong carry on over time because of reproduction. One of the most important differences between asexual and sexual reproduction that you will have to know, we're going to be comparing asexual and sexual reproduction at the end of the slides. But one of the most important differences that you need to know is the amount of variability that the new individuals will have after reproduction. Recall asexual reproduction. In asexual reproduction, you have exact copies being formed of the original organism. In sexual reproduction, it's a little bit different. There's more opportunity for variation. So let's recap and recall the types of asexual reproduction. Again, it involves only one parent, and copies of the parent are made. So it's as if the offspring is the exact copy of the parent. So it's like uh, the offspring is like the twin of the parent. So there were a few types of asexual reproduction that we talked about. We talked about binary fission, where the organism just splits. It forms what's called a cleavage, and then from that cleavage, it just kind of splits off from there, forming two identical cells. Budding is an example of where an exact copy of an organism is just stems from the organism itself. It just kind of buds off and eventually splits off from the original cell. An example of this would be a hydra. Um, then there was vegetative reproduction. In vegetative reproduction, really not a lot of movement involved at all, but if you just take, let's say, an aspen tree and you were to cut a part of it and have that cutting grow in a different area, it would actually grow and develop into the exact same organism from where it came. After vegetative reproduction, I believe we talked about spores, and spores are just um, they're not like seeds because seeds are involved in the formation of they're formed from sexual reproduction, but pollens are just they contain the DNA, and when they spread from a plant, for example, they develop and they will reproduce into the exact same copy from where it came. Okay, so in sexual reproduction, it's a little bit different. You have a combining of genetic material. We'll talk more about this in the next section from where the combination of genetic material comes from two different individuals of a given species. So in asexual reproduction, we have reproduction from one parent, and sexual reproduction, we have two parents. Um, During this process, the genetic material in sexual reproduction, it mixes up. So the genetic material, if you don't know what that is right now, we'll talk more about it later, is just the stuff of inheritance. Okay, it's the code that will allow for the growth and development and functioning of an organism in the next generation. So it's the stuff that um, allows for the transmission of information for the next species. Okay, that's the genetic material. And during this process, that genetic material is going to have a chance to mix up. And as it mixes up, it's now slightly different than the original genetic material from either of the two original individuals. So I think right now it's a good time to talk a little bit about DNA. And I'm not going to talk too much about it because that's going to be coming up in the next few sections, I believe next week. So DNA, what it is a blueprint for the construction of an organism. So just like you have builders, let's say they build a building, they have to go off of a blueprint that's made by an architect. Well, the DNA is that blueprint. It's a really good way of thinking about what DNA really is, because it has all the information for the growth, the development, and the functioning of an organism. So all the information that the body needs, for example, um, you know, to make proteins, to build muscle, to build certain cells. It's all contained within DNA. DNA is the blueprint that tells everything, okay? And that's what DNA is. So DNA stands for I'm not going to write the whole word, but DNA stands for deoxyribose nucleic acid. Okay, that's what DNA stands for, and we'll talk more about where we find those specifically. But DNA is the stuff of transmission of genetic material. So a little bit more about DNA. So if you remember grade 8 science, um, it's hard to draw here, but this is supposed to be a cell, okay? And in the middle of the cell, you have something that's called, you guys remember, it's called a nucleus. Oh boy. It's very hard to print with, a mouse. Right now I'm actually using the finger pad on my laptop, which is probably a little bit worse. But anyway, that's the nucleus in the center of the cell. And what the nucleus does is it contains DNA. That's where you're going to find DNA. So DNA right here is going to be found within the nucleus of the cell. Okay, that's where you're going to find it, right there. Okay, so if you can imagine DNA, there's a lot of information for everything. Like you are built because of the code of DNA. So there's a lot of information inside a tiny, tiny nucleus in a tiny, tiny cell. So this DNA has to be tightly coiled, right? It's very, very tightly coiled. In other words, it's really, really tightly packed. And when you unpack it, it actually looks something which I'm sure you guys seen before. It looks something like this, right? DNA. And you have these two ladders, the parts of the ladder that are connected by these rungs. And this is where you have those certain molecules we'll talk about that kind of give you the information for all the processes and the structure of an organism. Now, DNA is tightly wound up. It's wound up so much, so you have this, and this goes on forever and ever. Like it's just a very, very long structure, and I'm not going to draw it all because it's, and this just goes on and on and on. But eventually, what happens is that you have, this is really, really, really tightly coiled, very, very tightly coiled, to a point where, it gets so tightly coiled that I'm probably not doing it a lot of justice here, but it actually starts to look kind of like this. And if you kind of look at it, right? Oh, this is difficult to draw. It kind of looks like an X. So it kind of looks like that, just to kind of, that would be an example of some DNA. And what this is called, this whole thing, this is called a chromosome. Oh boy. Oh boy. Oh boy. Chromosome. That's an M, by the way. Chromosome. Okay. Oh boy. Chromosome H. Okay. So now, if you notice, there are two pieces to this chromosome, right? And different organisms, different species, right, have different number of chromosomes. For example, humans, we've got 46 pairs of chromosomes. So we've got 46 pairs. So this will pair up with another chromosome, okay? So you have 46 pairs. Dogs have 78 pairs, and cats have 38 pairs. Horses have 64 pairs. So different species have different numbers of chromosomes. So eventually what happens is during sexual reproduction, right, or before sexual reproduction, is these pairs, sorry, I actually made a mistake here. This is a pair of chromosomes right here. So this is what I meant to say. Sorry, this is a pair of chromosomes right here. And what happens eventually is that over time, when the cells divide to get ready for sexual reproduction, you get single segments of DNA. And so this number divides by 2 in sexual reproduction from the sex cells. That's 2, by the way, to become 23 chromosomes for humans, right? And again, it's different numbers for different species. So what happens is that you have sex cells being formed in the mom and sex cells being formed in the dad, and the fusion of these sex cells, you have 23 cells from mom, 23 cells from dad, will create a full set of 46 pairs of chromosomes in a complete individual in the offspring. So if we go back to this diagram I have here, N just means the number of chromosomes that you have. So in the sex cells, which are called gametes. In this case, we have 23 sex cells, 23 gametes. And in a complete individual, such as mom here and dad here, they each have 46 chromosomes. Now, if it were a dog, it would be 78 pairs each. If it was horses, it'd be 38 pairs each. Okay, and then they undergo something in the sex cells here in the ovaries in the female and the testes in the male. They undergo a process called meiosis, which we'll talk about later. And then through the process of meiosis, that's where they form, right, these cells here that have 23 chromosomes each. And these are terms that I know you are familiar with from your vocabulary. So 23 chromosomes in the sperm, 23 chromosomes in the egg. The sperm fertilizes the egg, and then you have 23 chromosomes from the sperm plus 23 chromosomes in the egg, and then you get what's called a zygote. And the zygote has a complete number of chromosome pairs, which is 46. And then after that, the zygote develops, proliferates, and over a period of 9 months, you get an individual, specifically when it comes to the human species. So that's a quick review of sexual reproduction. Again, these next few slides just kind of highlight everything I said. I'll go over them fairly quickly. So sexual reproduction usually involves 2 individuals. Most animals and most flowering plants reproduce sexually. Okay? And again, as I said, just to kind of recap, the offspring will have a mix of characteristics of both individuals, because during this process of cell division, and there's a chance for the genetic material to mix up. And as it mixes up, the organisms and the offspring will look slightly different than the parents. Not like in asexual reproduction. In asexual reproduction, it's just pure division of the cells, and there will be an exact copy, right? So the parent and the offspring will look identical. I'll go into a little bit more detail in another slideshow. So we'll see you soon.